Hey guys, Ryan Gill here with Hunt Primitive, where we entertain, educate, and inspire. And on this channel, we typically do primitive build or hunting videos, and occasionally, like today, we're going to do something a little bit more on the educational side, and hopefully inspirational, and really break down an interesting topic that a lot of people don't understand. And that is the penetrative differences between very large points and very small points in both traditional and primitive archery. So if this is your first time to the channel, do please consider subscribing. We've got lots of different type of content that we throw up fairly often, everything from the hunting videos to breaking it down to science on the board. If it has to do with primitive archery or primitive hunting, we're pretty much going to cover it because I'm doing everything I can to make you the best primitive hunter or primitive archer that you can be. So now when we talk about point size in general, this is something that stirs up a lot of controversy, but it's simply misunderstood. So it's not that the one side is wrong and the other side's right, or it's not that that side's right and the other side's wrong. It's not actually like that at all. It comes down to the application of the arrow and the point and even the bow that you're using. So hang with me and I'll work all that out for you. So I drew a couple really simple diagrams here and wrote traditional, retro primitive, which we'll talk about later, and then contextual primitive. Okay, so with these little guides this way, I'll be able to point to this and you know this is what I'm talking about. This is like modern traditional archery shooting, like Dr. Ashby type of points. Clay Hayes, very successful doing this. Mark Harrison, Omnivore's Quivers, very successful shooting traditional with very large points and getting great penetration and killing a lot of animals. Then we're going to skip down here to contextual primitive, which is basically any bow and arrow system that is made contextual to what primitive man would have shot and hunted with. And that means bows and arrows and strings and everything and points that are all made by Stone Age tools and techniques and also natural materials. Basically only what early man had. So retro primitive is a mixture of the two, and that is very popular with modern primitive archers today. So what that is perhaps a more modern arrow setup or modern bowstrings or a bow that is not contextual in style or construction, i.e. shooting a laminated longbow and shooting a wood arrow and a stone point would be retro primitive, where you're intermixing either the two technologies or you're intermixing the two materials, natural or man-made. So the performance of these different arrows is going to be wildly different depending on the bow and the materials and the context in which it's used. That's the part that really confuses people, because it's not as simple to say that we're comparing these all together and saying which one is best. Because at the end of the day, if you want to say which one is going to penetrate the best every single time, it's this one every time. There is no circumstance in which a heavy arrow with a very heavy steel point is not going to penetrate better than any of this contextual stuff. But that doesn't mean that contextual primitive archery isn't extremely efficient when it's executed properly. So if you're not familiar with the Ashby reports, I say do a Google search on that and kind of figure out what that is. But very simply put, heavy arrows and heavy front of center weight and heavy broadheads, steel broadheads, carry the kinetic energy and momentum to penetrate further than lighter arrows and smaller, lighter broadheads. That's pretty much it, black and white. So for example, Clay Hayes shoots, I'm not sure what grain they are, probably 200 or 250, I have no clue. Clay Hayes shoots the metal tough heads, which are really heavy. And he gets great penetration with that.
Went right through that shoulder and out the other side.
On, I believe, a parallel shaft, probably 11-30 seconds if I'm just throwing a guess out there. And that system is tried and true, and it's also like what I would call wrapped in plastic. And I'm not saying that everything that Clay Hayes does is wrapped in plastic. That's not where I was going with that. It sounded like an insult, but it wasn't. What I mean is you can buy all of these components from manufacturers wrapped in plastic. So the metal points are all created exactly the same, and all the work has been sorted out to where you take the correct size arrow shaft and fit it into the tapered ferrule, and they're all the same every single time. It doesn't take any sort of improvisation like you would get in primitive archery, where you're taking different arrow shafts with different tapers with different types of points and putting it together. So that is a completely different complex topic we can talk about a different day. But all this stuff up here, the traditional stuff, works so well because they're products that were made to work well and then mass produced. So anybody can buy this stuff and go shoot it. And when you couple that with a more modern bow, like a modern traditional glass recurve or longbow, or even a self bow. See, Clay Hayes kind of falls in a little bit of in between these two because he's not really retro primitive. He doesn't shoot the stone points and the natural like cane or wood shoot arrows so much. He does a little bit, but not so much. This is where he really lives, but he shoots a self bow, so he's kind of in between here yet. I mean, this isn't also, I mean, binary would be two, but it's not like that. I mean, this is a spectrum where somebody might be ultra traditional shooting carbons and glass bows or carbon bows and fast flight strings and the whole 9 yards, and then there's going to be steps. It's a spectrum going to go all the way down, so it's not so cut and dry, but hopefully you get what I'm trying to say here. So this tried and true system works extremely well when you're coupling it with glass bows and even retro primitive bow setups like Clay Hayes does, which is perfect, and it works perfect, and you get great penetration every time, but that's with steel points. So basically, for anybody that wants to take any sort of primitive bow or traditional bow and shoot metal broadheads, 100% follow this technology. It works, it's tried and true, and honestly, you're not going to improve on it very much at this point. You're going to get pass-through penetration with relatively low bow weights, because the system is optimized to allow it to be able to do that. But if you're somebody that is like me and feels a great connection with Stone Age ancestors and it's just in your blood and you can't get rid of it, next thing you know, you're starting to mess around in this territory. You want to shoot stone points. And that's where the big hang up is. Because if we apply the same technology as we use here to this down here, we have the great recipe for failure. So what most people do when they're transitioning from traditional to primitive of some degree is they carry over the same idea that I need a very heavy arrow and I need a very heavy large stone point. But the problem is that stone is significantly lighter than steel and therefore takes a much larger in dimensions point to create the weight of an equal steel point. So let me put that a different way. A steel point that say weighs 150 grains, we'll just say, steel point weighs 150 grains, might be that big. A stone point that weighs 150 grains is going to be that big. Does that make sense? Because steel is so much more dense, you can pack more mass into a smaller object. And on top of that, the steel edge is very sleek and very smooth, and it has very little resistance when it's going through hide, hair, and flesh. Whereas a stone point has a phenomenal amount of surface area and must have some degree of serrations to be truly sharp. And those serrations cause friction. So you can see where the problem starts to rise. So if we want to shoot a really heavy, say a 200 grain stone point, next thing you know we've got a massive chunk of stone on the end, and it's going to have some sort of serrations, and a lot of people make it worse because instead of just having one big long stone point, which still has its own problems because this is a lot of surface area in serrations, they make the problem even worse by rounding out the nose. I've seen this so many times. They round out the nose to get more weight into the point, and then even if there are some serrations on here, now this very blunt front nose of the point struggles, absolutely struggles to try to get penetration through even the hair and the hide. This is such a problem that I actually wrote an entire chapter putting data down on the static friction differences of penetration between a point like this with a round nose versus one like this that has a very sharp and steep tip geometry. That's in the static frictions test in my new book, The Secrets and Science of Primitive Archery. Okay, so now what happens when we use those very large points now, people don't get the penetration that they think that they should, or they lose the deer. Now, this happened to me many, many years ago before I figured this out, and I still hear yearly stories of people contacting me saying, I bounced a stone point off of a deer, or I only got 2 inches of penetration, or whatever, the circumstance happened to be. And I say, shoot me a picture of the stone points that you're using, and 9 times out of 10 they have a round nose, a lot of times no serrations at all, or they're absolutely giant. They're 125 to 190 grains or whatever, and as soon as they have the failure and they post about it on social media, everybody says you need to shoot a heavier, which would be a larger, stone point. And all that's going to do is compound the problem. Now you're going to get less penetration. And the reason is this. The benefits of kinetic energy and momentum gained in the same system that's very successful here. So I'm not saying that this is wrong. Again, I got to reiterate that. This is absolutely right. The Dr. Ashby report stuff is 100% right, okay? But this is an application to the stone points. The benefits that you will get in penetration from higher kinetic energy and momentum from a heavy, large point is now less than the losses that you're going to get from the friction of having a much larger stone point, especially with a rounded front. So we run into really a critical mass problem when it comes to friction. And that is why a smaller point is going to have significantly less friction, as put in that chapter. It starts on page 199, the static friction test. We do a kinetic friction test too, just the static friction test, so people can literally see the data on the difference between the large points and the small points and how much it takes to shove that through hide and hair. So after people have a bad experience shooting a very large stone point and bouncing off of a deer, then they blame that the stone point is the problem, and oftentimes they go the wrong direction again, and they say, well, now we just need an even bigger one. And this compounds the problem even more when somebody says, I'm going to go hunt a larger animal, like a moose or a bison, and they say, I need to have a 300 grain stone point, because now you're never going to get penetration into that animal. Now, there are some situations within retro primitive that this large stone point works very well also, or it works well enough. And that reason is because you're also typically shooting some sort of a modern bow, be it a glass recurve, a glass longbow, or even a more modern compound bow, which is completely out of context. But there's also people that shoot self bows or primitive wooden bows, and they still get adequate penetration with this. But the reason is they're also using a modern, say, fast flight string material, which gives quite a bit of energy that can be transferred into the arrow. So when we did that test in the book as well, that is the strings test between modern and primitive strings, where we compared the feet per second gains just by shooting a modern string versus a primitive contextual string, and you're looking at anywhere from 10 to 20 feet per second gains by shooting a modern string. So what happens is, if you're shooting sometimes this larger stuff, your bow, if you're shooting a fairly heavy bow with a modern string, it can just have enough power to just force its way right into the animal. And you're not necessarily going to see poor penetration. Some people still do. You might even get out the other side, and it would continue to lead you to believe that the larger points are definitely the way to go. But where this is really highlighted as a significant problem is when you dial it back to true contextual Stone Age archery. That's where we eliminate all of the modern components that give us performance advantage. So no more modern strings, no more steel-weighted arrows, no more high-performance glass or bamboo backings or anything like that. Simple wood bows, wood or cane arrows, stone projectiles, and primitive strings. So once we dial all of that back to true contextual primitive, now we see a major compounding problem that the large stone points are no longer being delivered with enough energy to sufficiently even penetrate the animal, let alone kill it, with any regularity. Because now our bows are shooting significantly slower speeds, and most people would say then the answer is to simply shoot. They go right back to here. Then the answer, if you're shooting a slower bow without as much performance, they say the answer is to shoot a heavier arrow and a heavier steel point or a heavier stone point. Because as we know, the benefits that you get from the kinetic energy and momentum from the larger set is greatly outweighed by the friction from the very large stone point. So the problem is this continues to be a constant circle, and people can never decide where to lay unless they get rid of this idea being practical in primitive archery. It's not. It's got to be this. Now let's explain that, because that right there is the answer to absolutely everything. Okay, so now when we get into this, I want you to know that this isn't theoretical. This isn't a hypothesis. We have the proof and the data and a lot of dead animals because of this right here. So it is no longer theory, it is absolute fact. And in the book, again, an incredible amount of information in this book for anybody that wants it, is we've got a whole chapter just on collecting data from shooting wild hogs with very, very, very small, down to even 12 grain stone points and very light arrows. So even down to, I think, 350 grains. And then at the end of the book, spoiler, I think you can see it on here, we went and took a lot of this very light stuff in small points and went and killed a bison with it, with contextual bow and arrow implements. Very small stone points, primitive sinew string, wooden bow, and cane arrows. And believe it or not, the lightest arrow out of the entire bunch, which was 422 grains, penetrated the furthest into the bison. So these little points, and you can see in comparison, size to my finger, okay? Very small stone points penetrate exceptionally well on a contextual bow and arrow setup. And that is because they have less friction when going through hide and hair, which is imperative when you're shooting a slower bow with a contextual primitive string. And I refer to it in the book all the time as the threshold of failure. Okay, this is why the book is so important, because there is so much more in that book than I can possibly explain to you in one video session in front of the whiteboard. And of course, it's very well highlighted and concise in the book as well, as opposed to me rambling on film. And then to take it one step further, this is where we found the biggest benefits, and it doesn't have to do necessarily with the size of the point. Now it has to do with the shaft. So a very quick point on this. So in our test, we took 11/32 traditional shafts just for the fun of saying, let's do this, and put a heavy point on it, 190 grain point, and shot it into a polystyrene target multiple times. And then where it was a fresh target, we never had hit any of the other holes, nothing like that. We marked the arrow every time after the penetration. We recorded it. All of this is in the book as well. Okay, this whole test is in the book. Then I took the same exact arrow, took the point off, which was in 11/32, I think 190 grain, it might have been 160, I don't remember off the top of my head. We did a lot of tests. And then I barrel tapered, just the front side of this from about 8 inches out. And we tapered the shaft all the way down to a little less than 5/16, and then I put a 5/16 70 grain steel field point on. Okay, so we went from like 190 grain, 11/32 parallel shaft, tapered it down to a 5/16 and put a 70 grain field point on it, and got more penetration every single time. There was not one single shot that we did not increase penetration. And the reason for that was when we eliminated a lot of material on the shaft, we eliminated a lot of friction. And that test was repeated over and over and over, and we even took a thin sheet of Luan plywood and we conducted the same test again, where we shot an untapered heavy tip shaft through the plywood and then into the target, marked the penetration, and then decreased this would simulate, say, shooting through ribs to see does that extra weight and kinetic energy and momentum add to our penetration if we hit something a little harder. And we still got the same results. So we then applied that to our contextual primitive arrows, where we have these very small stone points, and our shaft, is fairly large back here, and it's naturally tapered. It grows like this, a river cane shaft, so it's thinner on this end and heavier on this end. And then once we get to about here, this one actually has a foreshaft, which I typically don't do, but there is also a ton of information about foreshafts, filling, because somebody's going to ask that question, well, can't you just add weight to your shaft? Yes and kind of no at the same time. But that information's in the book as well, where we can even fill the end of the cane with sand. We did a ton of tests on that, and then checked all the penetration shooting those arrows as well, versus foreshafts and versus no foreshafted arrows. A ton of information in there that'll explain it all. But our shaft then is wider here, and then it tapers down to, some of these are less than 5/16 of an inch, and then putting a very small stone point on, and then we're getting plenty of penetration, especially up until the point where the arrow starts to get a little bit thicker, but we've already gotten more than enough penetration to kill the animal. So we repeated this in practical application, going out and hunting with this stuff to see, could we take 350, 380, 400, 420, 450 grain arrows and consistently shoot 2-hole penetration through both sides. I don't mean to pass through where the arrow just keeps going afterwards. I mean, just get out both sides of the animal, or at least get to the other side of the animal. That's really the important part, that we lacerate the entire thoracic cavity. And we were able to do that consistently over and over and over again on deer and hog-sized animals with very light arrows and very small stone points, shooting off of contextual bows with primitive strings. So then we put it to the ultimate test as seen in the book, and that is when we went and did a bison hunt and shot arrows that we didn't have a single arrow that was over 500 grains. The heaviest arrow we had was 498 grains. They were all sub 500 grains, shooting from a contextual Osage bow with a sinew string that shot about 160 feet per second. And we got more than sufficient penetration to kill the bison, and you can read about the entire story, or there's even a video on that as well that I'll drop down into the description. You can watch the video, but that doesn't tell the entire story. It just kind of gives you an overview of what to expect, more or less, in the book. Now, for those that maybe have just skimmed through that chapter and would say, well, yeah, but why didn't you just shoot like a heavier wooden shaft or something to get more penetration? If I was going to do this again and I wanted the most penetration possible, I would probably do some more tests on that, and I would shoot a solid wood shaft that would be inherently heavier, still have that very steep taper and a very small stone point, and we would probably get even more penetration. But at the end of the day, we got enough penetration to kill the bison. It takes a couple shots, of course, but people shoot bison with this stuff, and it takes a couple shots to kill it. So that's nothing new. We've seen bison get shot 2, 3, 4 times with this equipment, traditional bows and traditional arrows with very large steel points, and it takes a few arrows to really put them down in an efficient time frame. And we did the same exact thing with very light arrows, very small stone points, and very light taper with a contextual bow and a primitive string. That's the part that's really fascinating, is we really get the same results at the end of the day out of this that we do this. The worst thing you could honestly shoot is this. But in that test, what we were really trying to do is take a good contextual bow with a sinew string and then start to push the threshold of failure on the arrows. We wanted to see kind of how light you could go to efficiently kill a bison or another very large animal and do it successfully. Now, could we have shot it with a 350 grain arrow and got the same results? Honestly, I think we probably could have. Could we have ramped it up to a sparkleberry or a red osier shaft that maybe weighs 600 grains with a tiny point and penetrate further? Yeah, absolutely, I think we could. But the idea was we wanted to find that closer to that threshold of failure without actually failing. Because if we can kill a bison and get the best penetrating arrow out of the whole bunch, was a 422 grain cane arrow and a very tiny stone point. If that is sufficient for killing a bison, We will kill deer and hogs, as we have in the book many times over. We will kill them every single time. And we have great success with the very small stone points, as highlighted, the tapered cane arrows, light arrows, as opposed to shooting much larger stone points, which consistently have penetration problems. And if you can now understand that these two right here are not related, and you cannot intermix this technology, now you have an understanding of how to truly be efficient in contextual primitive archery. Alright guys, so I know that there's a ton of stuff that I probably wasn't able to cover that you have questions about, or something that you want to add to it. If you want to drop a comment down and add to it or ask a question, you're more than welcome to. I'll try to respond to everybody. I don't know if I can. At the end of the day, this is 428 pages in this book. It's not about book sales to me. It's about getting the information out there. We try to keep the prices down as low as possible on the books because I just want them in people's hands. There is an absolute ridiculous amount of data in this book. I just wanted to at least show you the table of contents. That's not it. That's the table of contents. Okay? You can pause the screen or zoom in or do anything you want to do and have a look at it. Okay? There's a ton of information in this book, and if you are interested in primitive archery, be it true contextual or retro, and quite honestly there's a lot of good information about the traditional stuff in here as we compare the two, but you can get this information other places. This truly is about primitive archery and everything that you need to know about being the most successful primitive archer and primitive hunter that you can be. So please do check that out. Okay, it's The Secrets and Science of Primitive Archery, and it's at huntprimitive.com. So again, thank you for following along, and I really hope that this helped wrap your head around the differences between traditional and real primitive archery, and to show that neither is right and neither is wrong. They're just simply different. It's apples and rocking chairs. They're not even in the same food group. So thanks for following along, and until next time and we catch you on the next adventure, good luck in all your primitive archery endeavors.